here. We're here to celebrate the 225th anniversary of library services in Georgetown County. So they started way back in 1799, and they continue to today. So, and going strong, hopefully for another 225 years. But we appreciate y'all being here to help us celebrate that, and some friendly faces out there as well. We want to say thank you to South Carolina Humanities. This program is supported by SC Humanities. It's a not-for-profit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. And it receives funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The catchphrase is democracy demands wisdom. So, and we got a great lineup that will give us a lot of wisdom, nuggets of wisdoms throughout this series. There's some flyers on that back table. You can see what's coming up in the fall part of the series, and you can also grab a bag. We have these wonderful, we got a lot of swag, GCL 225 swag, so you can grab a bag, grab a schedule, grab a, Dr. Cates deserves, he's earned his pad. So these nice pads are back there, magnets, so lots of swag. Take it with you and tell your friends. And so today we have Dr. Madison W. Cates. He is an assistant professor of history at Coastal Carolina University. He's also co-director of the Institute for South Carolina Studies at Hobcaw Barony, which I know many of you know, great place there as well. And I guess I was telling Trudy Bazemore, our associate director, earlier this morning. She was like, what's he like? And I said, well, he's kind of like the new Chaz Joyner. And that's Dr. Charles Joyner at Coastal. He really was a major historian, internationally known, did great work focusing on the Gullah people right in this area in Georgetown County, and their unique and brilliant history. And so, you know, I think Chaz would be very pleased that Madison is sort of has taken over that spot at Coastal Carolina University. So without further ado from me, let's welcome in Dr. Cates.
Thanks, appreciate it. Wow, as a Southern historian, it's hard to get much higher praise or much more of a higher bar to live up to. I'm sorry I never knew Dr. Joyner, but from what I've heard, I can say that I do not have nearly the musical talent that he had, so I'll spare you that. But of course, I bring greetings from Coastal Carolina and the Bell Baruch Institute for South Carolina Studies, as Dan said. And it is Coastal. Being from Coastal, it is Tuesday. It is technically Teal Tuesday. I didn't think about the fact that this has been recorded, and it will be known that I'm not wearing teal on Tuesday, but they'll have to forgive me for this one. Oh, look at that tie! Yeah, Teal Tuesday. So, but maybe this blue in a certain light could be teal. But I'm delighted to be here. Delighted to be a part of a great lineup of speakers. I guess maybe I'm kind of in the middle of some great speakers that have already been through, and many more to come. And I'm trying to block out my Thursdays to make sure. Right, Thursdays, correct? Or Tuesdays and Thursdays to make sure. Excuse me, what day? I already said it was Tuesday. To make sure to be here for some others. But thanks so much to Dan and to all the folks at the Georgetown County Library for arranging this and making this happen, to South Carolina Humanities, and to a number of different people who I will put up in a second if I can work this thing. Of course, if you know anything about Hobcaw in the past 2 years, there's been a lot of effort to devote time, energy, attention, resources to studying the history of enslaved communities in the 12 or 12 plus plantations that made up what is now Hobcaw Barony. And so just a thanks to a few different organizations that have been a part of that. Coastal, of course, Francis Marion, the Baruch Institute, South Carolina Studies, USC's Baruch Marine Institute for Coastal Sciences, I think it is, and Georgetown County Library. Thanks also to the library staff who helped me print out my notes, and also our Hobcaw research team. All of them are listed up here. Lynn Hansen, who has been our fearless leader, is also here. Thanks to some other folks, Jody Barnes with SCDNR, who has exchanged we've compared some notes and documents, and she's doing some incredible work, and has been helpful for me. Justin McIntyre, who also sent me a couple resources that helped my talk from the Maritime Museum. CCU library staff for dealing with all my many ILL requests, and to two Prince Fellows, a research program that the Department of History at Coastal does, Obria Alston and Aaron Johnson, who helped me help me with a lot of research and trying to sort of construct a good bit of this narrative that we're going to get into today. So yeah, lots of thanks. If you want to learn more about the Baruch Institute, there's a QR code that I worked very hard to figure out, despite my technical deficiencies, how to do that. So anyway, I can come back to that, or we can talk about that later. As I said, I'm a Southern historian. I'm also a bit of an environmental historian by training, and so in diving into studying the history of Hobcaw and the surrounding area, I like to begin by thinking about, and sort of the key through line throughout this talk will be thinking about not just the human history, but the way that the human history intersects with the natural history of this area. And so if you go to Hobcaw today, a lot of what you will see, many of you know, are trees and forests and wetlands, and you will see some incredibly, well-preserved structures, including Friendfield Village. At the same time, it can be hard, even as a historian, somebody who knows that this is not how it always looked, it can be hard for even the somewhat trained eye like myself to imagine or sort of picture what it was like, 100 years ago, 150, 200 plus, even, longer than that. So I want us to kind of think through together how we sort of work backwards, how we think about the role that people have in history, but also the way that the land, the waters, the woods, everything plays a role in history, and particularly in the history of slavery around Hobcaw and surrounding areas. And I've used this, some of you may have been to other talks I've done, and so some of this may be a bit familiar, or maybe you forgot it like I'd forgotten some of it, and that's good. But I'm a big fan of, and you can look, I believe his website's still up, David Soliday, Soliday. He did a lot of aerial photography in, I want to say about a decade ago or so, of old rice fields across the Carolinas and Georgia, and basically created a number of exhibit, I think it's called Remnants of Rice Culture. And I've always been struck by sort of these photos, and I think any of us, if we're honest, to be honest about it, should be. To think about what it took, to think about the labor, the immense human costs that it took to create this landscape, and also to the fact that it's also sort of powerful, I think, for me, not only to think about that, but also to understand that, to go back to my example of Hobcaw, like it's hard to envision maybe what it was like exactly 150 years ago, even maybe, but here we have something that kind of is a visceral reminder, I think, of how history is both a long time ago and also not that long ago. that this is something that was created, and this was something that was formed through the labors and through the knowledge of enslaved African Americans in the Low Country, and it's still we can still see the remnants, the scars of slavery in this way as we drive, over the bridge over there, as I did, and that's just, I think, something that helps us remember that this is a part of our history, this is a part of our community, and it's something that it's hard to necessarily easily divorce ourselves from. And so in thinking about that, I want to provide just some brief, I don't want to get too much into historiography because, I know that it's not, at least my students' favorite subject, but what historians have written about the past and how it sort of shapes our approach and how it has shaped my approach. So a few different historians, a few different books that think about how enslaved people related to the land around them and to the geography around them include David Soselsky, who wrote a really great book about enslaved watermen in kind of the Outer Banks region of North Carolina. Stephanie Camp, who writes about the way that geography could be both something that could be liberating and could also be constraining for enslaved people in shaping the way that they would resist or escape or things like that. Mark Stewart, who writes a great book about rice culture and the way that the way that the natural environment has been shaped on kind of the rice coast, particularly of Georgia. And then the last one, David Silkenat's Scars on the Land, Environmental History of Slavery. I find that idea of scars on the land being a particularly apt mental image because it reminds us that slavery left, scars on the land and scars on people at the same time. And that, like a lot of scars, some don't heal very easily. Silkenat also writes, he has a chapter in there about the Great Dismal Swamp, which you can see pictured here in one of these famous paintings by Thomas Moran, in which enslaved people are trying to escape through this very dense, kind of wilderness, swampy wilderness area. And Silkenat describes wetlands in general as an inhospitable refuge, meaning in the sense that on the one hand, it's a refuge, at the same time, it's something that is often dangerous and fraught with peril. And I want to kind of use that as a springboard to think about this area, to think about the area around Hobcaw itself, being that it is shaped by the waters of Winyah Bay, the Waccamaw River, the Atlantic Ocean, and then to think about the ways that it shapes something called the Long Black Freedom Struggle. And historians sort of use this term to kind of cover a long territory, right? We have the civil rights movement, and that's part of the long Black freedom struggle. We have the abolitionist movement, and that can be part of a long Black freedom struggle. And to think about that, and to think about the ways that struggle is not maybe always just about organizations and open rebellions or mass movements or voting, marches for voting rights, although those things are obviously significant in themselves. But to also think about what scholars sometimes call like micro-rebellions or acts of smaller resistance that maybe aren't, a Stono Rebellion or a Nat Turner's Revolt or something like that, but are smaller in nature, but nonetheless significant in their intent. And when we think about this idea, we might consider it could even something as simple as enslaved people organizing their own worship services on dark nights away from the gaze of their enslavers, where they could talk about, read from the Bible, read books like the book of Exodus and talk about, and get a different sense of what Christianity means for them, for example, rather than what maybe they heard in the plantation church where the few passages read were, slaves be obedient and things like that. Or it could just be simple acts of hiding out, running away, slowing down a work, ways of carving out a small measure of autonomy or freedom in a tyrannical system that offered little of that. And I think using some of the historians that have looked into the environmental history of slavery before, I've talked about, again, that idea of an inhospitable refuge, that the environment can be both a constraining force that can prevent people, enslaved people from easily escaping or running away, or in some ways it can be a liberating force. The Great Dismal Swamp being a sort of prime example of that. Many people believe that's where Nat Turner, who led this revolt 1831 in Virginia, was headed to hide out in this place. And that when we think about maroon communities where enslaved people would hide out and try to form sort of on the very margins of society, or in landscapes that were seen as kind of wild, untamable, etc. And that kind of brings us back to this area. We know that there are, in ways that made enslavers very anxious and made it impossible for them in some ways to detect, that enslaved communities had sort of what are sometimes called grapevine communication networks. They were able to communicate in ways that were often undetected or couldn't be detected till later. And I'll bring up these two examples briefly, but there is some evidence in kind of the post-Stoner Rebellion investigations and the post-Denmark-Vesey investigations in Charleston, that possibly some of the organizers of these conspiracies, or in the case of Stono, an actual revolt, had made contact with enslaved communities almost as far north as here. And so that just shows that there are things happening among enslaved communities that are trying to resist their enslavement, even in small ways or even in big ways sometimes. And although, as you know, Georgetown, there was this one insurrection scare in the late 1820s, which I'll mention briefly, we can see some evidence of this in some of the accounts, particularly travel accounts in the late 1700s that stand out. Elkanah Watson, who was a Philadelphia or Pennsylvania based businessman, was traveling down to Charleston near the end of the American Revolution, and in crossing Winyah Bay on the east side, going toward Georgetown, he claims that he encountered a group of 17 black men armed with poles along a swampy road near a ferry. And he suggests that this is something that had been heard of, or that he had heard about, and many other reports from enslavers at the time suspected that runaways often would be hiding somewhere on the Waccamaw Neck. And so, could this be evidence of some kind of maroon community existing somewhere over there? I think potentially. It seems like this group, at least 17 in his record was the number, hiding out in the woods and being armed with poles and kind of acting threateningly. Similarly, William Bartram, the naturalist who was traveling south near the somewhere between Winyah Bay and the southern end of Long Bay, recorded that he encountered a group of enslaved African Americans carrying hoe, or they could have been free, I don't know, but carrying hoes, axes, and clubs. And he said, quote, he had heard rumors of roving bands of runaway slaves in this desolate place and feared they may betray hostile designs. It didn't happen that way, but nonetheless, the fact that Bartram had heard that there were possibly these, as he calls it, bands of runaway slaves in this area, suggests that in some ways, the geography, at least in the late 1700s, potentially provided ways for African Americans or for enslaved people to run, to hide away, to shelter themselves, even if only temporarily. As you get into the period of the early Republic, the early 19th century, early 1800s, it's from, I draw a lot of examples from this book, Ryan, Quintana making a slave state, where he talks about, he gives a number of examples from Georgetown in which white citizens and white leaders are desperately anxious to try to control particularly black men and women in their boats, to prevent them from using their boats to kind of go in a lot of different directions, or in a lot of different places, particularly to go downtown and to sell rice or to sell different crops or wares without having an official ticket, as it were. And that allowed them to sell their stuff downtown. And this is sort of consistent with a lot of what we know about both kind of life and labor in the rice fields, that on the one hand, because they're so vast, because they have all these creeks and canals, that enslaved people also, because they were out working in these fields, knew different ways, knew the geography, knew how to navigate, and knew how to find places also to hide out or to hunt, to fish, to cut wood, whatever it may be. We also know that the lack, particularly of kind of protein and meat, that enslaved people would often have to supplement there's something called the caloric gap. They would have to supplement the lack of calories or key nutrients they got by sort of hunting or fishing, something that we can imagine probably happened a lot out on the rivers in Winyah Bay and places like that. And a lot of this testimony suggests that it did. You can see 1810, the example I already gave. 1818, white citizens asked the General Assembly, can they do anything about, quote, trade carried out by Negroes in boats upon our rivers? 5 years later, another petition. There's this practice, quote, of Negroes navigating the rivers and creeks in flats and boats for cutting wood and other purposes is still ongoing. At one point, they also sort of cast aspersions on petty shopkeepers in Georgetown. They claim somehow amassed these vast stores of rice without really the clear means to do so. And so perhaps there was some kind of collusion or cooperation between enslaved people piloting boats and shopkeepers themselves. There was also an attempt to blame both these groups for a supposed arson at one point around 1810. Furthermore, another petition in the 1820s said, it is well known that, quote, that many Negroes have the free use and control of flats and boats, and some also in companies are generally supplied with firearms. In this way, the vigilance of the patrols, talking about slave patrols, is defeated, and incalculable mischief results to the planters and others. For about a year, Georgetown would get state funding to fund kind of an extra patrol, or it's particularly in downtown, and then people in the upstate in particular felt that was kind of favoring the wealthy planter elite, and that was kind of done away with. But a couple of events in 1829, the insurrection scare, 6 people hanged. And there was this claim that Northern agents, Northern abolitionists, were sneaking in and kind of whispering in enslaved people's ears, maybe metaphorically, about insurrection and getting these ideas in their heads, and didn't really. The idea of freedom was already in their heads. Didn't need Northern abolitionists to do that, and also giving them supposedly liquor and stuff. So there are all these sort of. What I'm always struck by is how much planters, enslavers, how deeply paranoid and anxious they are. And especially in a place like this where they were vastly outnumbered. In some ways, it shows that as much as we think of these people as enslavers as all powerful, incredibly wealthy, and they were incredibly wealthy, it also shows how deep, the fact that their anxieties and fears also run very deep, that they know that all of that is dependent upon a system of forced labor, and that if that goes away, all of this is coming crashing down. And that kind of comes through again and again. That comes through 2 years after the insurrection scare, 1831, the Nat Turner Revolt, which kind of gives makes real these sort of nightmares and deep-seated fears of the planter class. I'm going to kind of skip ahead in time, but by 1858, one enslaver, James Sparkman, wrote, quote, "The control, management, and entire discipline of enslaved people has materially changed over the past 20 years. Crime and rebellion are much less frequent. Runaways are fewer and less lawless." And I don't sort of know the full, maybe some folks in here or folks elsewhere may know better than me, why that changed. Certainly after Nat Turner, there's increased patrols, there's increased concern, there's increased resources put to control and management, but nonetheless suggests that 20 years before, which in the 1830s, that at one point runaways were more frequent and things like that. Control and discipline was more difficult, but something in the 1840s and 50s kind of changed that. But at the same time, all this suggests that enslaved people often try to use their intimate knowledge of the environment, along with their access to boats and things like that, used it to their advantage. Well, maybe that would be a financial advantage. Maybe that would just be potentially to try to escape and gain their freedom. And it also suggests, number two, that enslavers' fears about runaways and insurrection were not just a matter of being vastly outnumbered in terms of population, but also a matter of feeling kind of one step behind in trying to control the people they presume to own. And it also suggests that their fears about Northern abolitionism were already deeply rooted in the late 1820s and early 1830s, and thus by the late 1850s and into the Civil War, how much more had that grown? With sufficient opportunity and chaos, we might wonder how difficult it would be for enslavers in Georgetown district, Georgetown area to stop mass runaways. And that kind of gets to the main subject that I want to get to today. The coming of the Civil War, and how did over 1,000 people formerly enslaved end up on North Island? That, of course, begins by talking about the Union Navy, something I won't get too much into, but if you know, the Union has this blockade. They have this, what's sometimes called the Anaconda Plan, this idea of building a naval blockade around the South, cutting it off from its major trade routes, particularly to England and Europe, from the beginning of the war. And of course, if you know anything about the history of the coast of the Southeast, particularly down in Port Royal, and where you have the Port Royal experiment, late 1861, Union troops taking over, enslavers flee, and you have this kind of large population of now kind of freed people. That's a fairly, I think, well-known, now with the new Reconstruction National Park or National Monument and all that. A lot of people know a good bit about the Combahee River Raid, which is later in 1863. But there are important and similar stories with maybe less famous figures that also took place around here. So as the Union blockade sits off the coast of Georgetown, they slowly begin to kind of test the waters, begin to kind of move inland and they find that vast stretches, particularly along the Waccamaw and other rivers as well, are kind of lightly defended, and they kind of begin to take chances, moving in, taking rice, and they also find that enslaved people are actively wanting to come on board and go back with them to North Island. And so you begin to see in the spring of 1862, after Union forces have raised the American flag on the North Island lighthouse, North Island, of course, being kind of the symbol of kind of enslaver wealth in this area. The lighthouse, or at least I think the original lighthouse, had been built by enslaved laborers decades before. And so now these freed people are being brought back and stationed and kept on North Island. A number of enslavers, including Daniel Jordan, who owned land on what is now Hobcaw, fled inland. Plowden, C.J. Weston went to Conway. Jordan went to Camden. And but as other enslavers had found out in Port Royal, often in the chaos that it was difficult to fully control and round up all the enslaved people to go with them. And some slipped through the cracks and found ways to escape. And that could account for a good number of how eventually at least around 700 people, but probably upwards of 1,000. Some estimates put it as high as 1,700 people end up on North Island. These formerly enslaved people, before kind of the Emancipation Proclamation, are not considered fully free yet, but they're considered contraband of war. And this term is a really sort of fascinating and a bit of a difficult term to wrestle with, because contraband suggests property. Contraband might be something that in the case of war, a contraband of war for the Union could also be a Confederate cannon, a Confederate, let's say, horse or something like that. So contraband suggests property, but at the same time, much as Union soldiers would not give Confederates back their cannon, they were not going to give them back what they consider property, and that being enslaved people who are now de facto emancipated or de facto free, even if they are not yet technically free. You also see within this, historians like to get into this question of self-emancipation, right? It's kind of a chicken and the egg type thing. Did enslaved people, when they got on Union boats, right? Who did the emancipating? Was it the soldiers or was it the people themselves? Maybe it's a little bit of both in this case. But nonetheless, it's clear, I think we can assume that through those kind of communication networks, or just through hearing sort of guns go off, that enslaved people knew what was happening. And from a lot of what we know in general about the way the Civil War proceeded in the South, we know that enslaved communities actively sort of kept up, whether it's through communication networks, whether it's through people who could who somehow were able to read and could get access to newspapers. There's a lot of really interesting stories about that, but they were able to keep track of the war in ways that surprised their enslavers. And so within that, this is a depiction also of the North Island camp, contraband camp that was put out, or it's held, you can look it up, by the New York Historical Society. I think it was possibly drawn by, I would assume, a Union soldier. I haven't quite found the original, but within this, we have, probably most relevant to Hobcaw, a group of at least 20 people who escaped from Alderley Plantation sometime between September and October 1862. And the reason we know about this is because James Orr, who was a Confederate senator in the Confederate Senate from South Carolina, collected pretty meticulous records from enslavers who were petitioning the Confederate government for reimbursement for their losses. And this particularly, there's a lot of them down south near Beaufort and Hilton Head and Port Royal, but there's a good many from Georgetown as well who petition. They document sort of, here's who the people who enslaved people who they knew they lost, and they put their age and what they presume to be their value. And so for Joshua John Ward and Mayhem, I guess is how you say it, Ward, they put this petition in. This is February 1863, saying these 20 people had absconded to the enemy. And to get back to that question of, who does the emancipating? Absconded is kind of an interesting word. On the one hand, they say they were enticed away by the enemy, that being the Union. On the other hand, they say these people absconded, and at least based on my brief kind of venture into the dictionary for absconded, synonyms, you might say escape, flee, run away. And so clearly there is some kind of agency, at least, toward these folks. And it's not hard to kind of imagine that they, whether it was their knowledge of the tides along the bay, whether it was their knowledge of some kind of the landscape, that they used that to possibly escape to North Island. So far, I haven't found, there are ship logs for a lot of the ships that were stationed off North Island. Jody Barnes, who I mentioned, DNR has a lot of those. And I haven't fully gone through them to see, like, is there a report from one of these ships that they picked these people up, or nonetheless, it's clear that a lot of enslaved people went on their own volition without needing a ship to kind of pull up the way that happened a couple times up closer toward Brook Green. We know this because in November of 1862, Henry Middleton from Weehawken Plantation wrote, quote, for some months, enslaved people have been in numbers leaving different plantations, and generally it has been by water, right? And so that suggests, he doesn't say, well, the Union military rode by and picked them up, although that did happen, but suggests that some of this was just done on enslaved people's on their own decision, right? And so this led at one point Middleton and others to establish what they call kind of a makeshift naval picket or guard between Frazier's Point, which is on Hobcaw. Thanks, Lynn, helped me make this map, and Dover on the other side of the bay. And it seems like potentially that maybe had some impact, because at least the Union Navy's records, which is a lot of what I draw from in this research, kind of suggests kind of a fading off of the reports, right? There's at least 1,200, maybe it's upwards of 1,700 by midsummer 1862. And obviously these folks from Alderley leave in September and October 1862. But the reports don't quite have that same flood quite after that. And then you can also see the names listed here of the folks who escaped from Alderley. And you can see their ages listed. I think it's also an important reminder that their ages are listed often as very sort of, I would call these ages estimates, because if you know anything, you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, one of the most, stunning sort of but small things he mentions is he never knows his birthday, he never knows when he doesn't know when he was born. And something that, is worth remembering. So I think that's why potentially you see the ages as all ending in 5 or 0. And you see the value estimates as well. And so what happens when enslaved people get to North Island? Well, that is a matter that is hard to decipher from the historical record. We know by the end, a lot of them, because of difficulties gathering enough food for them, because of disease, and because of viruses that were circulating, and because of threats from the Confederate forces on shore, that eventually all of them were moved toward Port Royal, Beaufort area, which was considered safer. But in the meantime, there's a couple accounts that emerge, and I've selected two from the Confederate side and then from the Union side that kind of present life on North Island in different and not flattering ways. So Reverend William Mallet, I guess is how I would say that, I may be wrong, was an English clergyman who was the sister of Mrs. Plowden C.J. Weston. And while the Westons had moved to Conway during the war, he came to visit his sister to let her know about a relative who had died or something. And he writes this account called An Errand to the South. And you can look it up. Coastal's Digital Commons has digitized it. And he eventually ventures down to Pawleys Island and is talking with a number of folks. He claims he has conversations with Union officers who just happened upon shore and just wanted to talk or something. He also claims, and probably one of the, I would say, fairly unbelievable and hard to believe accounts, that an enslaved man swam over from North Island to Pawleys Island and has this whole conversation with him where the contraband, I guess at this point, this formerly enslaved man says, yes, we're being kept on North Island basically against our will, and we would go back to our masters if we were allowed to. But it's terrible there, and we would come back if we wanted to. But oh, by the way, I'm going to swim back because, yeah. So I have a hard time believing that account, but nonetheless it exists, and it serves to kind of illustrate how I think particularly folks from kind of the Confederate or the enslaver point of view kind of came to sort of understand this place, and certainly, or came to understand the fact that a lot of enslaved people had escaped to this place. Another way, so yeah, I would not, we always think about should we take documents at face value? Rarely, right? And certainly not in this case. Account from a Union naval officer named Paul Henry Kendricken portrays the life in the contraband community as largely uneventful. He mentions that they gathered timber for projects and built small boats, but he also had he had a very negative and frankly racist attitude toward the contrabands, and portrays the Union troops as kind of playing kind of cruel pranks on them, firing off guns and kind of scaring them at random points, taunting them and saying they would return them to slavery if they stepped out of line. He claimed they appointed this one contraband king of North Island, and sort of mockingly doing so. So it suggests that life for contrabands on North Island, they are kind of in some ways literally between the devil and the deep blue sea, if you will, but also that Union soldiers' attitudes toward them could be pretty mixed. And some in the officer class, maybe could be a bit more respectful sometimes, but other than the enlisted men, maybe not so much. It's also worth thinking about that this Union soldier is saying the contrabands were so scared of them, they didn't want to step out of line because they were afraid they would be sent back to slavery. And then Reverend Mallett is saying, claiming that these people would come back to slavery if they were allowed to. One of these is neither of those can be, that's quite contradictory, I guess, obviously. It is true that conditions were quite difficult. Diseases thrived in such an environment. There are reports that smallpox was prevalent on North Island. That's not particularly unusual if you know anything about the Civil War and how many people died from disease. Early in the war, when Union and Confederate soldiers gathered together in sort of their early musters or camps, diseases were quite widespread. And so the fact that you have folks kind of coming from different plantations or different parts of the Hobcaw Neck or this area, it's not unusual, right? But it's still difficult. And it's also clear that the stories about this disease running rampant spread pretty quickly. And you can imagine that particularly folks who had an investment in maintaining slavery, like Reverend Mallett, would be clear to say, hey, if you go to it would be clear to tell enslaved people, hey, if you go to North Island, you might die, there's disease out there, it's horrible, you're mistreated, right? You can see how this becomes kind of a form almost of propaganda. And we see this in one of the Federal Writers Project interviews with a man on the Ark Plantation. He mentions that he saw a flatboat full up with enslaved people that go down the Hobcaw to North Island, and that he also heard that there was quite a lot of disease, or I think he mentioned smallpox explicitly on the island itself. Union soldiers, particularly as they got into winter, had difficulty, and they write letters procuring enough clothes because people came just with the clothes off their back. Procuring enough food, they would try to raid various rice storehouses and mills along the waterways. And they were always concerned about attacks, particularly from Pawleys Island and Murrells Inlet, from Confederate troops. And so, there were numerous credible threats, and this sort of all these combination of factors kind of prompts that decision to move these folks away from North Island and down, particularly toward Beaufort, where we know that a number of them end up joining the Union Navy or the U.S. Colored Troops, or USCT. Into 1863 and 64, there are more attempts that the Union Navy records of enslaved people swimming to their boats or trying to escape, particularly around the Santee Delta. And also, it suggested they needed more support to reach Union ships by this time. And maybe that Confederates had got better at preventing these runaways, maybe not. It's also worth thinking about that this island community, this contraband community, being kind of a threat to slavery itself, not only as a place where people could run to and gain their freedom, but also where formerly enslaved people could then eventually get passage to a place where they could join the Union Army and fight in a war to emancipate other enslaved people. And so with that, there are at least, based on some of the research we've done, at least 173 black men from Georgetown we know of that joined one USCT division or another. And we're trying to look for connections between names to see if any of those match up with the folks from Alderley or from Hobcaw itself. But we know that Robert Blake, an enslaved man from the Santee area, eventually won a number of commendations for his service in the Civil War. And there's a few cars that we found, sort of census records who served in the USCT, but haven't kind of established a firm connection to Hobcaw as of yet. I want to sort of linger on two different points because in Southern history, there's always, and in history in general, irony is a really rich kind of vein to tap into. And I would kind of leave you with 2 points of irony. One, the idea that North Island, what does it sort of symbolize or represent? What was once kind of a symbol of the planter aristocracy and wealth and power, becomes a symbol of freedom and of emancipation, in a sense. And it's worth kind of lingering on that and thinking about, as much as we know about, again, these other places where these incredible sort of emancipation events happen, that one also kind of happened just off our shore, however many miles from where we stand and sit. Another sort of irony that I want to linger over is to go back to the land again, to think about the fact that we know how rice plantations work, the way that they use these tidal flows and that they are located along the bays and the rivers around here, And the fact that that is a major part of building the immense wealth that was amassed on the backs of unfree, forced labor of enslaved communities. And at the same time, as much as the land and the landscape helped enrich these folks, it also kind of made them vulnerable. And again, to that point, it's a source of wealth and a source of vulnerability. To think about how much anxiety those white Georgetonians had about enslaved boatmen just trading their wares or being able to kind of escape detection or control. And so as much as we consider enslavers powerful, wealthy, controlling, the more we understand about them, the more we see how obsessively paranoid they were about things they couldn't control. Even on a minor level, spring rains ruining rice crops, abolitionists in the North, the Republican Party politics or what have you. And probably most importantly, the thing that as much as they tried to control the very people they considered property, who were actually never property, they were always reminded they were a people with some measure of agency and autonomy to shape the course of their own lives. And for African Americans freed on the Walkable Neck, whether in 1862 or 1865, their desire to exercise the full measure of that agency and to reap the long denied fruits of their labor, to build lives on these lands and on these waters where they had lived so long, guided much of the joys and the sorrows that followed in the long Black freedom struggle to come. Thanks. Yeah, I have a nice little notepad to write down questions on. Thank you, Georgetown County Library.
We are getting pins too.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So,
Come back to the pins.
all right. Any questions?
Madison,
Oh, whoa.
Madison,
Yes.
do I understand that on North Island itself, there was not an opportunity to actually join a Union troop there? It would have to have occurred somewhere else.
It's a good question. Yeah, was there an opportunity to join there? I think I would. I'm trying to remember when the policy was sort of set forth that black men could join the Union military, particularly formerly enslaved men. My sense is no, and I'm not sure sort of fully why, to be honest. I'm not a military historian, but I'm sure someone out there could answer probably better than me, anybody know. But it may have had something to do, if I had to guess, with also the status of being contraband of war. And once you get the Emancipation Proclamation, there's some law policy that's passed, and I know I talk about it in class, but I can't remember it now, that's passed. I want to say it's in 1862, late 1862, early 1863, that allows black men and formerly enslaved men to join the Union military. I can't remember what it is, but yeah, it's a good question. Not that I can tell that, I can't tell that happened. Yeah, it seems like they were moved and then, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm putting myself in the picture of studying Georgetown for a long time. Georgetown County, Horry County. We are quite diverse. We enslaved people and enslaver is only one piece of our civilization.
Mm-hmm.
We had people free of color. And I'm gonna give one good example real quickly is Joseph Rainey.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a vast majority of enslaved rice growers, which were pretty much autonomous because they were only one in a rice field because of malaria. And the few people that owned them, I hate to say, get the heck out of Dodge. So the autonomy was always there. The other thing is the European or the people, others that came here were fishermen, Portuguese, Jewish. So I'm only giving a suggestion because this is where my eyes look at. There was quite a diverse population of people here in Georgetown, Horry County. Particularly the merchants along Georgetown. So the last thing I want to say, and that because I've studied, is that we were one of the first to have a major Reconstruction era. Because so many people were already free. So many Africans they're free people. And how you would know that is to look at the census records by 1860s. And you'll see enslaved people would not have been named, but free blacks would have been named in the 1860s, maybe before the 1850 census.
Right.
I hope that makes sense to you.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. The point about the other communities, particularly merchants and kind of fishing, people involved in fishing, I mean, it makes sense too that in a port, maybe as not much of a, as big a port as other places, but still a port city was a place where a lot of things could happen, and a lot of people, if you read, a lot of you probably have, I'm sure, read Frederick Douglass talking about, the way that things could slip in and out of people could slip in and out of port cities in some ways, free, enslaved. But yes, sorry. But yes, so that's a great point. It's something definitely to, yeah.
That's it.
No, that's great. That's great. If anybody has more to add, I'm here to learn just like everybody else. So, Yeah.
How long did the newly freed enslaved people stay on North Carolina?
That's a good. I want to say. I meant to say that. Isn't it in the timeline? I know there's a report from a Beaufort newspaper, and I want to say it's December 1862, early December, where it says a lot of contrabands arrived from Georgetown, many of them wanting to enlist in the Union Army. I want to say it's late 1862. I could be wrong. I don't think it's in my notes. It should be, but yes, there's a report from the New South, which is a lot of it's digitized, and so at least. Yeah, I don't think I wrote it down. That's unfortunate. But that's my brief recollection of that is for a lot of them, it was a matter of months. And then as others arrived, it would be, it just kind of depended on, I think, ship availability or things like that. But at least for the initial kind of wave, for a lot of them, it was, I guess, about 5 or 6 months or so. Yeah. And I think, again, winter kind of also played into the calculus of for the Union officers, how many supplies do we have? How much do we have enough clothes and blankets and things like that? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been archaeological research into the camp that was there?
It's a good question. I asked someone about that, and I don't want to sort of, as I recall, there's some difficulty because of getting equipment out there, and then also with the way that, particularly with if you take this picture correctly, right there, right on the shore, has some of it washed away or has some of it with the chain, how much could you really find? That was the response that as best I recall the conversation, that was kind of the thing. Because it seems like, yeah, potentially you could find things, but not to my knowledge.
Is North Ireland Island part of Hobcaw?
It's part of the Yawkey Preserve, yes. But I think originally, or at one point, it was, so.
I just know that Joey is doing archaeology out there as we speak.
Yeah.
Joey.
Oh, Jody is? Okay.
Joey is doing archaeology right now.
Okay. Excellent.
Oh, one other question. The slide that has
Mm-hmm.
Robert Blake,
Mm-hmm.
can you tell me what the first name of that?
Israel, I believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. On the census record. Yeah. I can't remember. Yeah. 1860, October 1866. This is muster out date, October 10th, 1866. Muster in Hilton Head, 1865. Born Georgetown. Period listed, 3 years. And I continue this, I have it. Yeah. I think it was through Ancestry or Fold, through one of the genealogy sites.
I've got we've got those lists from 1865, 66, 67, and 68.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one of those lists where I think there were as many as 18 members with the surname Carr.
Right, yeah.
I want to go look and see if I find
Yeah, I think I looked, but I couldn't see it. But it's possible now that we have more information. It's possible that there maybe is a match now. So, yeah, I can definitely send this. Other questions or thoughts?
I should introduce Vinny Daysmore, who will be speaking as part of this series on rice growers in,
End of September.
yeah, yes. So, and it's on the schedule back there, so you can come back and catch Vinnie here as well.
Be here.
It'll be here, yes. But, yes, I've hired her. All right. Thank you. 26 at 10 a.m. in the morning right here. Same place, different time. All right. Well, I think we'll let Dr. Cates off the hook here, but let's give him another big round of applause. Thank y'all for coming.